So what other...
or ABRing.
That's right. What other polarizing topics come to mind? Is gender polarizing based on our culture?
Well, by nature it is.
No. Yeah.
Like, physically and, just like it is an interesting choice of words because we are made to be like
different
polars in terms of how we fit together, and that's physically, but I think that's true from the top to the bottom.
Sure.
That's why
neurologically, whole 9 yards.
Yeah.
Welcome to How I See It with me, Mark Pratt, and
Justin Sternberg. This is a podcast that works to counter cultural polarization through thoughtful conversations. But of course, I don't mean, a woman can't do a man's job or a man can't do a woman's job, or job, quote unquote, right?
Sure. Capability.
Right, capability is not the same. And of course, watching the Olympics, it's like there are some women that can far surpass anything I could ever do. And yet we still have a separation in the Olympics, right?
Sure.
Which, of course, with transgenderism and stuff like that, it's blurring a little bit.
Sure. In
some cases, and it's like, well, what's fair, right?
Yeah.
But the reason they're asking what's fair, even in saying, should a man who switched to a woman, be able to participate with the women?
Right.
Why are we even asking if that's fair? Well, because we recognize there is a clear difference between the amount that's able to be accomplished in a men's sport versus the same sport with a woman. And that's why there's separation in most sports. Do I think no women could compete on a man's level? No, of course not. That's not what. But there is a distinction there that we've come to agree and internalize from the beginning of time. And I don't know anyone who would want to obliterate that completely, right? And yet, sometimes that can be the struggle, is it's all the same, there's no different, or like...
You don't know anyone who wants men and women to be completely equal?
No. I think equal rights, I mean, that's kind of obvious, but equal opportunities. But yeah, I can't think of anyone that I believe would really say, I think everything should be on equal plane across every aspect, so bathrooms are shared, whatever. I don't know, like every single thing, the store, you shouldn't have a men's and women's section, it should all just be one area, or I don't think I can
where does that
picture anyone who would want to flatten that completely.
Where does that agenda come from then?
Which one?
For the fact that, in the past while, we've had this desire to do away with that difference.
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons, and I think obviously I want to hear what you think. And just a disclaimer, we've been talking about this, that everything we say here is how I see it, right?
Yeah,
and
doubt.
So there's an understanding that we're just conversating about things that we think about and we process.
Sure.
And sometimes the things that we say or we think, they're half baked, right? Like,
sure.
Like you'll ask a question on the spot, and now I'll have to process it, and what comes out might be less than half baked. It might be raw, or have a little salmonella in it. And that's okay, because that is kind of the whole purpose of this podcast, is to present ideas from a single perspective.
Yeah.
And then have a conversation from another, the opposite perspective. In some cases we have the same perspective, but
Well, and I think it's important to be able to say, yeah, some things I feel very strongly about in how I see, and that may come across as arrogant, or it may come across as I'm the one that has the answer, and that's not our desire
Right.
in this context. We're, like you said, we're having a conversation in such a way that challenges one another, and we might even have strong opinions that come across it sometimes, but it's in a desire to share and say, okay, this is how I see it. Tell me how you see it.
Right.
And am I able to, is this the whole picture, or is this just a side of the end of the elephant, if you will? I see a trunk, you see a tail. So, you know, at that point, is it even an elephant if what you see is so much different than I do? And I think that's where these, you know, topics come into play.
Yeah.
Is they're so much broader than we can do in a, you know, 20-40 minute segment, but yet there's a desire to have that conversation.
Yes. Well said. I'm a software developer. I've been doing that for a little over a decade now, and there's this concept or this saying that I've heard in software development that kind of applies here, and it's strong opinions held loosely. So essentially, like in software development, there are paradigms for how you code, how you develop, you know, how you build things. And they are very, you know, depending on the paradigm you're following, most of them are strong opinions, right? Like, it should always be this way. You should write your code in this manner. You should use this and not that.
This is the correct way.
Right. And I think, you know, the ethos is let's hold to this until something's better. Because it provides structure, it provides consistency across the code base, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, software aside, I feel that same way about life in general. Like, I have strong opinions, but I like to pretend they're loosely held. I like to assume I'm willing to have this conversation, right, Mark, that we have, and we can come to a new understanding. We can modify that strong opinion or even back down on it, you know, as has happened in the past between us, where it's like, oh, that's a good point, that I haven't thought about that. And I think sometimes strong opinions can scare people off, right? Like, it can be, whoa, I don't need you telling me what it is or whatever. And I'm not sure that's how I don't feel that way at all. Like, there's so many things that I have such a strong opinion about, but I'm like, but I could be completely full of it, right? I could be making this up. I am making this up. Wait a second. But I still feel it strongly. I intuit it. And my personality type, I've taken a few personality tests, and intuition's pretty high. That doesn't mean I know everything. Just so everyone knows, I don't know everything. No, but it's this idea that a person doesn't necessarily know all the things, but they have an intuition about which direction to go, which direction to head, if that makes sense. And of course, intuition can be wrong so often, but I lean on that, and then I run with it, and it's treated me pretty well in my life in terms of progression, and in terms of relationship, and in terms of most things. I can't think of a part of my life where my intuition has like drastically failed me, except in areas of resentment.
Okay.
That has failed me there plenty of times, where I go, oh, I know what this person's thinking, and I know, and so I've learned to go, I don't really trust you, intuition, here. But for most things, I'm willing to trust my
because your intuition is multifaceted.
Yeah.
You have it in you may have intuition where finance is concerned. You may have a certain intuition where spiritual things are concerned. Even a relationship to a certain degree, but there may be those areas, and I think in our culture, as I think about, you know, areas where intuition, as we talk about gender, even pornography can be an area where my intuition may be completely off based on my exposure, because it becomes tainted
Yeah.
And I guess that's where I'm at to a certain degree is how has gender, the aspect that we are created, if I may say so, male and female, how has that become such a tainted area in our culture? Or is it an area that maybe isn't that tainted? Most people, from your intuition perspective, hold to the fact that yes, there are benefits, and yet at the same time, it seems like there's this conflict. You know,
Yep.
and I think I see it. And I'm here again. I don't want to overgeneralize, but I think I see it more so in the adolescents that I work with.
Yeah.
This confusion that is there over, you know, gender, and at times, you know, even sexual preference playing into that. That there's a what I would call there's a well, I think there's a healthy confusion, you know, from an adolescent perspective that's quote unquote normal. But I think our culture has made it to where, you know, yeah, that confusion is normal. But at the same time, I think our culture has taken that confusion and said, well, then you might need to consider that you're, you know, you need to consider an alternative lifestyle at this point in this confusion. And I think it brings to that point the intuition, how that's counter to the fact that yeah, growing up, adolescence is tough, and I think there are parts of our human design that are counter to well, this is the way that it is, and yet where we always look for that option that says okay, but it's not the way that it has to be. And sometimes that can lead us down a road towards greater confusion than the ability to say, okay, I see the structure, I see the design, I see the purpose. I'm not sure I completely understand it all, but I can recognize there might be a greater purpose in this than I'm realizing in the moment. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah.
I think in some ways, and I'll look to you at this. I see it in some ways like a tattoo. You follow me? Because I think as a person who has many tattoos, you know, I can look at it and say, okay, yeah, those all have meaning to you. And yet to go out and get, you know, make up my mind that I'm going to get a tattoo at 13, 14, 15, that might not be the most beneficial time for me to make that decision. Because there's going to be a lot of life that is going to be made, you know, decisions that I might make that I think are wonderful or great right now, but that might not benefit me long term. And it may not even be something that I want to have as a part of my life, you know, years down the road.
Yeah. And trying to remove it at that point is painful.
Yes.
And yeah. And there are many people who already know you with that tattoo. Like,
yeah.
And you can't escape that version of yourself, you know, if you decide to change or you know, like remove the tattoo.
Yeah.
You know. Yeah, it's tough. Yeah, and your question earlier was, you know, where's this coming from? And
yeah.
I think the answer is way too multifaceted to cover in a single session, but I think there are some pieces of it that I would like to speak to, and one is the poisoning of the well, right? Where the structure as it is has worked well for many things.
Okay.
And then there are places where it's failed, and that's normal. And then there are places where it's just downright evil, right? And because we're human and we sin and we have a sinful nature, we tend to take anything good and we can make bad out of it. That's part of our unfortunate nature. And so I think, you know, the patriarchy, right? This whole idea has been like that's a big rallying cry down with the patriarch, right? This
Sure.
idea that this structure as it is needs to change, and I do think it has a lot to do with the poison in the well, and like you said, hurt people, and hurt people who have been hurt tend to run in different directions, we said earlier. And I think, again, there have been so many men throughout the course of history, and even so many men I know in my own life through stories and testimonies at Celebrate Recovery and all kinds of things that have abused their position. And as a result, done evil in one way or another. And it could be taking advantage of someone financially as a boss. It could be, as evil as rape. It could be in a marriage set up where there's a codependency there, and the man has full control and he's unwilling to relent with some of that. It could be, you name it, right? It could be the bullies in the schoolyard who's, like, I guess I have to play this role out. I'm a bully who beats people up, or else, what am I, kind of thing. I don't know. Like, there's so many places where the structure as it is has been twisted to become evil. And as a result, if you're the victim of that evil, you want that thing to go away from the top to the bottom and redo it in a way that's safe. And so I think that's a big part of it. And there's so much of that of course, I agree with.
Doing away with?
Doing away with some of the structures that allow that evil to persist. Now, I don't believe that there's no value in the patriarchal system, right? Of like, I don't believe there's no value there, but I can understand someone who does believe there's no value there, if that makes sense. If I can empathize with their position and go, yeah, this system has done nothing good for you. Well, I can totally understand the perspective that it has done nothing good for you, right? While also understanding that everything has nuance. And so we tend to take for granted the things of the current system that benefit us and not necessarily give credit to it for being that system.
Gotcha.
And so we say this whole system has to go away. And there's many examples in history where we said that, right? Someone made that stand, someone made that declaration, waged war against the current system. They won, and guess what? They lost the benefits of the past system. Now they gained some of the benefits of their new one, but recognizing like, oh, that whole benefit came as a result of that system, and we can't reproduce it in this one. Does that make sense? I'm being very vague in general, but I believe intuitively that this is a thing that has occurred throughout history, and even between regimes of government, right? Or someone comes in and takes over a government and says, we're going to redo it this way, and they have these rallying cries, and then they change the system to modify it towards that understanding and belief, and then the oppression moves from this corner of the country to this corner.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And as you're saying that, it's where, kind of walking through this gender dynamic, feminism may become one of those things that kind of comes to mind to kind of bring it back to the gender dynamic. Because if I think that even itself, as a father of a young girl, a young adult, I think of, how I think of feminism on a continuum, if you will. It's not that,
that's good.
It has to all be one end where we just rail against everything and we want to wipe out everything masculine. And I think, like you were saying earlier, so much of that depends on my view of masculinity based on how I've been treated by males.
Yeah.
And if I desire to, if I had a negative experience, I might desire to, emasculate all things male from my arena. And I don't think that's always healthy, like you're saying, to do away with one at the cost of the other. And I guess that's that's the part of me that wrestles with, okay, how can we take this, I'll call it healthy design of being created male and female, how can we take that and make it not necessarily just palatable, but how, and maybe even make it is the wrong word, but have it be appealing in a such a way that says, okay, there is a purpose in this, there is a design, and that design is healthy when we take these genders and view them from a healthy design perspective, not necessarily a flawed human perspective, which we live. And I realize I'm getting maybe a little deeper philosophically, but it's still something that I wrestle with in this how I see it as a male, and yet I desire for there when I'm working with ladies or young girls who have been raped, as you said, or abused in some way that completely affects that gender perspective. It makes perfect sense, but yet there's a part of me that says, okay, how can we recognize that that's not everyone, that there are males out there who are human, of course, but yet desire to value the things that are feminine.
Yeah.
And value that in such a way that says, okay, you're unique, you're special. It's not that you were just created for my specific enjoyment or the ability to abuse. Because I think that's where the hurt people just hurt people again.
Yeah.
In that dynamic. And I guess for me, where this comes from, as I stop and think about it, I probably have it's not a unique perspective, but my perspective on the genders are that God himself not was, but I think about it from a creation. God is so big, and there is so much of who God is that cannot be just reflected in male or female. That part of being created male and female reflects God's image in such a way that there's so much of him, it can be reflected in both male and female. And that's a wonderful God-given design. And it frustrates me when that gets hijacked in some way by our human design.
Yeah, or the intent to compress it into a normalized middle ground.
Yes.
Loses some of the value of the outer ground, right?
The immensity of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I guess that's where, and so much of that rolls out into identity and purpose. Yeah. And, even just security. And, and even as I say those words, I think about how, men and women would hear those words and they'd look at them so completely differently.
Yeah.
But yet, identity is a part of every person's role. And how do we walk through that? And how do we embrace, that God-given identity? And yet in such a way that values and still recognize we live in a human fallen world to a certain degree that desires to hijack that design. And I guess that's where the passion for me comes from, in that, okay, what do we do with this?
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned a few things, and one of the buzz phrases that came to mind was toxic masculinity, right?
Yes.
And
yeah.
And also the other thing that I was thinking about is the Me Too movement, right?
Okay.
That happened a couple years ago. Of course, it's still going on, but I saw some unfortunate reactions to that. And it really bummed me out, especially coming from people that I believe are, believers in Jesus, and like they follow. And all that to say, I was very much for this is good, this is important.
Be more
this
specific.
Needs to happen. Just like what the Me Too movement is, right? Yeah. So essentially,
and you're lumping the two together for the most part. Is that correct when you say toxic masculinity and
right?
the Me Too?
So that was kind of a segue into the Me Too movement. But yeah, essentially, the toxic masculinity exists everywhere because we're human, and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So what I mean by toxic masculinity, I'll give a few examples.
And it exists everywhere because we're human.
Yeah.
So when you say that, there are males who will make the masculine dynamic distasteful because of the way they treat other people. When you say it's everywhere, help me understand a way that I can see toxic masculinity around
that's
me.
Fair.
Because I think what it is to define it is different than just having another label.
Right.
You follow me?
Right. Yep.
That's what I want to.
That's good. And by everywhere, I don't necessarily mean every human being exhibits it. What I mean is it's pervasive. And so bullies is a perfect example of that. Now, not every bully is a man.
Sure.
But there's this, I think that's a direct product of, toxic masculinity where the masculinity is exhibited in terms of exerting strength over weaker people, right? And when masculinity is associated with that, it's toxic. Every time when you exert your strength over the weakness of another, it's toxic, right? Or the never fail dynamic of like, I'm a man and I can't let you down or whatever. That is toxic because sometimes you have to fail. Sometimes you have to drop to your knees. Sometimes you have to surrender. And that's the most manly thing you can do. But toxic masculinity says never give up, never die, right? Or competition, right? Toxic masculinity says if you win, I lose. And that's true of, other men. It's also true of women. It's true in the corporate ladder. It's this idea that I'll do what it takes to get ahead. And I think, again, that's not unique to toxic masculinity, but I think I see larger portions of it in the masculine side than the feminine, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I hear where you're coming from.
So those are just some examples. Does that help?
When it's just a question that comes to mind. When you see it in a feminine from a female, is it still toxic masculinity at that point?
I mean, nothing's universal, but I definitely think there very clearly could be roots in it, right?
Okay.
Where it was modeled, and you say, if I want to get ahead, I have to be like a man, and a man does this, right?
Gotcha.
Or, and that could be a couple generations removed, where you're like, my mom was this way, you know what I mean? And so I have to be like that, and potentially the mom, got
a
that from
transgenerational dynamic.
Correct.
Where it's passed down.
Yeah, but I definitely think, I believe that more of it stems from the male side than the female.
So in some ways, if I'm hearing you correctly, it's like toxic masculinity has been, chauvinism, to a certain degree, has been relabeled.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good.
Because, I mean, what we're talking about this moment, like you say, in a lot of cases, wouldn't be any different than chauvinism, where the man just knows best.
Yeah. Yeah.
And a woman's role is in the home, and that's it. That's all of, and we clearly know that that's not all that females can do, or in that phrase are good for. Okay, not to sound I'm just repeating the phrase. Exactly. Clarification there.
That's the chauvinism, right?
Yes.
Right.
So in some ways, that has been relabeled. But yet it's taken on a little more nuanced perspective of toxic masculinity. So, and I guess that's where as I'm processing this with you, and I realize people out there can't necessarily see my gears turning, but I'm sure you can. But
if you turn a certain way, I see them. Yeah.
And I guess that's where it comes back to, maybe from this human design, is, yes, maybe a female may have learned that, some transgenerational. I could pass toxic masculinity down to my daughter, but does that make it, toxic masculinity for her, or does that just make it pride and arrogance?
I think that goes, yeah, sure.
What I think that goes.
I was going to say, I think that's when you bring up the word patriarchy. That's when the system is the problem, right? Like, that's when it's pervasive throughout the system. So the third generation still getting the result of the system, right?
Sure.
And that's where they would say that's why we have to dismantle the system, because even daughters of a third generation are receiving the problems of the system, right?
It reminds me of that scripture that says, sin to the fourth generation, but there is a freedom that comes through, following Christ and in that dynamic. And it's just, as you share that, it just, that verse comes to mind. I don't necessarily quote it well, but yet being able to recognize that, yes, what I don't deal with in my own life will have a far-reaching impact, probably greater than I realize in that momentary desire to do things the way I've always done them, because this is what I was taught to do.
Yep. And that's why it's so important to work to break that generational sin, that generational curse. So, even as, like, any men listening, right? We need to understand that there are aspects to the system that are wrong, and we should not continue to make them persist in our own lives. We should work to fight that. We should work to say, no, I don't believe I'm better than a woman, or I don't believe I have to, stomp on people to get to the top, or we have to fight those things that, chauvinism and or toxic masculinity. And I think I love what you said about it's just a rebranded chauvinism, because I haven't heard that word in a long time, right?
Sure.
And I think you're right. I think it's just a new generation's way of saying chauvinism, right?
Yeah.
Which, you go back a little bit, further, chivalry was the word, and that was the inverse, right? Like,
sure,
don't be not chivalrous, right?
Yeah.
Like, but I think that
was the code, if you will,
yeah,
for being masculine, is that you opened the door for ladies. Not that they can't open the door for themselves, but it was not a show isn't the right word, but it was a demonstration of respect.
Right, a deference. Yeah.
Yes, a deference. I like that word as well. Yeah. And it's funny as we think about this reshifting, adjacent opportunity is what comes to mind. And that's really a fancy way of saying adjacent opportunity would be what the elevator was to skyscrapers in the 1920s. Okay? So we wouldn't have had skyscrapers for 200 stories if the elevator hadn't have been invented prior to that or around that time. You follow me? Because one isn't going to happen without the other. That's the adjacent opportunity. Something happens, and I think for me, that adjacent opportunity that our culture has is to value the differences in our genders.
Right.
It wasn't. I mean, for me personally, it wasn't until I began to recognize the value in the difference. The value in the difference between my wife and I. When I was when I was in that process of saying, man, she's just weird and that's wrong, there was no benefit, there was no value. But when I was able to see, okay, the fact that security is important to her and that comes into finances and it comes, and I'm not saying every female's like that, but to be able to value that security in such a way that says, okay, she's not complaining. She's not even really criticizing. She's just sharing a concern. And when I can see that as a concern, that's my adjacent opportunity. I have an ability to see things differently, and there's so much more opportunity there.
Yeah.
It's a value.
Stephen Covey talks about that in terms of synergy, right? It's 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2. 1 + 1 = 3, right? So that's kind of similar to your adjacent opportunity, but this idea that when we're together, me and my wife, we're so much better than we're apart.
Yeah.
And that's, that gets into marriage or whatever, but I do believe that's true. And I think one thing you slightly hinted at, you said it's not to say that all women are good at that or whatever. I think that part, especially when it comes to marriage, is like so many marriages fit together different ways, right? Like in some marriages, the woman is better at doing the finances, and so she does, and the man does other things, and vice versa. In other marriages, it's kind of flip flopped, and so I don't think any woman is the same or different or whatever. They're all different, and so is every man.
Sure.
And in some cases, there's value in the difference, right? And
yes.
But those differences could fit differently depending on the relationship, and that's okay too.
Yeah, because I think what you're describing are roles.
Yeah.
And roles don't necessarily define gender.
Right.
Because we can enter into this relationship, or we can actually value. I can remember, many women that I grew up with, from a construction background, who I would just as soon work with as many men, and to where, I'm recognizing that, it's not a limiting factor, and yet there is this abundance of roles that both genders can have.
Yeah.
And I think that's where sometimes that hijacking, if you will, wants to take it and say, no, we can do this, but you can't. I can do this, but you can't. And I think that's where we're no longer talking about gender at that point. We're talking about a role, and I want to be the only one that can do this. When in reality, yes, you can do this as well as I can. And maybe even better, which probably is part of that insecurity in me saying, okay, I have to come back to this role that says you can't. And I think that becomes that chauvinism, toxic masculinity type thing that basically says, okay, there isn't room enough. And I guess that's where I differ. I differ from a culture that says we have to be defined by roles.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yep. There's a couple things I thought of when you're saying, because you were saying there are natural strengths to each gender, right?
Sure.
You would argue, I would argue, and I think most people intuitively would admit that, right? But I also think there are weaknesses, and that's where the toxic masculinity can be born out of those weaknesses, right?
Help me understand that. When you say there are weaknesses, can you give me?
Like, it's as a result of being a man, you're likely going to struggle with things that a woman won't, or vice versa. And so, like a woman, for example, many women struggle with self-value, self-worth in terms of beauty, in terms of that, and that's that's pervasive through our culture. And I mean, before I move too far into this, we could totally blame the patriarchy and say, well, it's because man has always demanded that women present themselves, whatever.
I hear you.
But the point is, a man can just loaf around wearing whatever he wants and doesn't care about his image, and it's okay, right? Where a woman is like, if I do that, I feel like I'm slob, And of course, again, this is not all women. We know that, but most women that I know of.
Your experience, how you see it. My
experience, yes, how I see it, right. It is this struggle of like, how do I present myself and how does it determine my worth? And Yeah. And that's a struggle that's unique to that gender. And again, I recognize that there could be listeners who would say, yes, but that's only because of the system.
Sure.
I don't believe that's true, but whatever. And I think...
And if I may, I think the balance of that, I agree with what you're saying, how image can be, something that females, I think power is another balance to that in men. Mm-hmm. And I think of John Eldridge, his Wild at Heart, and the wounds that are passed on, the hurts that are passed on. Basically, a female desire would be, am I pretty enough? Am I beautiful? I'm twirling in my dress. Am I attractive? Whereas I do think, that boy growing up, am I strong enough? Mm-hmm. And I think those are the things that we wrestle with. And I think it's so important that, I think it's so important to see how God has designed us from this male female to say, probably, no, I'm not strong enough as a man. So therefore I need some help. Mm-hmm. And it's in recognizing that I'm not strong enough that I can enter into this relationship, number one, with God, and yet number two, with other men who basically help me develop healthy masculinity. Mm-hmm. To be able to recognize, no, Mark, that's chauvinism, okay? That's sin. Mm-hmm. But yet being able to be chivalrous, to be able to value that there is this inherent difference between being male and female, and it's not for me to exploit, but for me to value and appreciate, much like God does any of his female design, in that ability to say, yes, you are valuable just the way you are. Mm-hmm. Made up, not made up, dressed up, not dressed up. You're valuable just like you are. Mm-hmm. And it's not about being pretty enough for anyone, because I think you're beautiful just the way you are. Mm-hmm. I've created you that way. And I think that's a healthy thing for, I think sometimes, as I'm even thinking about this, I think God can factor into that God equation, if I may, factors in, well, he's just this and this and this, and we put him in that same bottle that says, well, and that's another topic for another time, but yeah. So yeah, I appreciate you sharing on this gender stuff, because I think, our culture has made it something that can be polarizing. Mm-hmm. And I just, I guess that's the desire I have, is to be able to recognize the value in it, and how both sides can recognize it as a part of design and see the value in it.
Well, this is a great segue into the idea of this podcast or whatever. Is so often we value our side and devalue the other side, right?
Sure.
Whatever the polarized topic
based on the difference. I know, right. I see that.
And so gender, I mean, it's very much, we've seen that, obviously, men have had the upper hand in most, right, cultures. Mm-hmm. And it's like, this is the better side. This is, we want to pull things this direction or whatever. And then vice versa. I think, no, you guys are toxic and it's all broken and we need to pull this way. And the truth is somewhere in the middle, right? Yeah. Which is, there is value to both sides, which is essentially what you very eloquently said. But that's so true of so many of these topics. And like you said, they're on a continuum. And so the truth is not always right in the middle.
I hear you.
I recognize that, right? And in terms of the gender conversation, I've heard a lot more compelling arguments in the last 10 years about how there are some things that need to change on the masculine side than the feminine side. And so for me, that continuum is, I'm a little on that feminism side of like, I support change. I support better educating our males to be real men. I support taking away those implicit quote unquote rights they have to oppress and to be the bully in the schoolyard. You know, I support dismantling some of that system for the sake of teaching our men to be better men. Right?
Sure.
But I also recognize, and I guess I should say, I'm not willing to say the whole system needs to come down and that whole down with the patriarchy or whatever. There is so much value in the current system that gets lost in these conversations. And the only way we're going to find out some of those values is to dismantle it and go, oops, we probably shouldn't have done that. Right?
Yeah.
Because I do believe there's purpose in the design. And again, so you also mentioned adjacent opportunity, and it made me think about opportunity, right? Which is this idea that I want there to be equal opportunity for my daughters. And you mentioned having a young adult daughter, and just how that changes our perspective. It changes how I see it, right? Because now I look at the opportunities available to my son versus my daughter, and I go, that doesn't seem right. I want her to have the same opportunities. And thankfully, I think she has every opportunity, right? And I don't even believe we have to let the system define what opportunities we have. I think we can still work hard at, like, I was reading about a referee in the NFL who's a woman, and she got into that. It's like she wasn't willing to let the system tell her she couldn't be a referee in the NFL, you know? And that to me is so cool, because it's like the system's always going to oppress somebody or keep somebody down, but we don't have to honor that system. We can fight to push through it, right? Break the glass ceiling, whatever that is, right?
Whatever that is. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm hopeful for my daughter that she'll break a few glass ceilings, that she'll get through kind of that perceived limit of what a woman can do in a particular role and say, nope, she's going beyond that, because there's no reason she should have to stop there. And she's going to fight for it. She's going to work for it. And she might have to work harder than my son. And I'm thankful for that for her, because the character it's going to produce is going to be so valuable. Now, at the same time, do I wish she didn't have to work as hard? Sure. But I also recognize the value in it. And it's just, it's very nuanced, right?
So you bring up an interesting design, because you mentioned we were both fathers of females, and like you say, do you raise your son differently because of that perspective?
Well, before having a son, I didn't think it would be that different.
I gotcha.
And I think that's where, you know, the very clear designs come through. When your son doesn't pick up dolls, he picks up cars, and no one taught him that. Yeah. That was very striking to me with my son, because I had two daughters, of course. Yeah. And, you know, it was, I think my youngest was about 3 when we said, and my oldest was 7 when we had him, something like that. I don't want to do the math right now.
It's okay.
So no one quote me on this. Megan, if you're listening, I'm sorry if I got it
wrong.
When
you listen.
When you listen, that's right. But yeah, so when he was born, it's like I had this pattern of parenting that I had developed, right? And it kind of, a lot of it changed, and it was like, this is different. And I wouldn't have guessed it, and I certainly wasn't trying to make it different, and it certainly wasn't because of the culture he was in. He was too young to be part of any culture, if that makes sense. He wasn't in any systems yet, you know? And just seeing how parenting shifted in some ways, where there were some things you had to say less with him, and some things you had to say a lot more with him, right?
Sure.
Than my daughters. It's very fascinating. So yeah. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, it does. I mean, and but when you said it, I was just thinking about us both having females, and you know, I have a son as well, and I guess in some ways, I would say that has impacted the way that I raise my son. Yes. Because I want him to be able to value, and for me, that I look at that as a gift, because if I had 2 sons, I might have missed out. I mean, I grew up as one of two boys my parents had. And I just think about how, a female in that equation would have made it different. Not right or wrong, but just different. And I'm thankful, but yeah, I think there's something to be said, even if I would have had two boys, that there's a value in being able to say, okay, and I'll just use, a Joe as a son's name. It's like, Joe, okay, that's not the way we treat, girls. It's not the way we treat ladies, in a way that values them. And I would have hoped that I would have shared that, when I saw it. And, whether I had two sons or whether I had a son and a daughter or whether I had two girls, this ability to, as I see it, value the other gender. So that's how I see it.
That's how I see it. Thanks, Mark. Hey, thank you for listening to our podcast. If you like how I see it, please do all the things that podcasts tell you to do. Subscribe, rate, review, follow us, and or talk nicely about us on social media. If you want to reach out, the email is us@howiseeit.click. Yep, I said .click, as in .click. Please tell your friends about this show, and we'll see you on the next one.